I am delighted to welcome Zach Powers to Politics and Prose. It's the release of his first full-length novel, First Cosmic Velocity. Zach is the Director of Communications at the Writers Center in Bethesda, and he has won awards in the past for his short fiction, specifically the collection Gravity Changes. In this new novel, the main characters, Leonid and Nadia, are treated as cosmonaut heroes in the Soviet Union back in 1964, two of the first humans in space. But it was a state-sponsored deception. Their twins were sent to space and never returned. Now the Earthbound twins are paraded around as evidence of socialist victory. In this beautiful, soul-searching, and mystical novel, Leonid grapples with the supposed loss of his brother, guilt at remaining behind, and also questions of faith, where he's constantly reminded of the heavens in a country that has outlawed God. This novel is a tender look at the space program and the family and home that is created in the wake and destruction of the one that is left behind. The official release date of the book is tomorrow, so you're all able to be here for the early release. And I read the book all in one sitting last week on the beach, and I had the sunburn to prove how you just can't put it down. So please join me in welcoming Zach Powers to Politics and Prose.
I heard chanting. That was great. So first of all, this is Neil Armstrong's birthday, and this is mini Neil Armstrong, so he's going to join me on book tour. I guess I should have the book out. Actually, before the book, it being Neil Armstrong's birthday. So after I'm done reading, for anyone who would like to take a selfie with the book, I have two pieces of swag that I'm happy to provide to you. One is this 8x10 print of a prose poem, for lack of a better terminology, that I wrote, and I will read shortly, about Neil Armstrong. And the other is a pin of the space dog Strelka with the title of the novel on it. And both of these were designed by Stephanie Grimm, who is sitting here in the front of the row. Woo! So I should also confess, too, that we went over to Comet Ping Pong for dinner, and I said, I'm going to get a drink to relax and some liquor, and they provided like a quadruple, which I didn't know was a size of liquor. Anyway, so thank you also to Stephanie for drinking most of it, so I could still stand up here today and not lose it. So anyway, to begin, this is a piece called Neil Armstrong, Folk Hero, on the occasion of his birthday. Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon when he was only 3. And there he planted 10,000 apple seeds, and he felled the trees that grew from the seeds with a single swipe of his giant axe, buzzed the blue ox at his side. And he hammered out tunnels through Milky Gray Mountains faster than a Saturn V, and he died in defense of Tranquility Base, the relentless solar winds assaulting the fleecy gold of his faceplate, winds named for a saint, though names notwithstanding, no one can doubt the true saint in this story. Neil Armstrong, standing light in his boots, saluting the black, impossible sky. Thank you. So, any questions? Okay. No. So this is the book. This is the Harry Potter midnight release party of the book, which is really exciting to me. I already had the one prop, so I didn't bring my Harry Potter wand, or that would have happened too. Two props would have been excessive. So I'm just going to read the beginning of the book. So hopefully there's no explanation needed, because this is all you would have if you picked the book up yourself. Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan, 1964. Nadia had been the twin who was supposed to die. But she lived, and it was her sister, the other Nadia, who departed. The chief designer placed his hand on this Nadia's shoulder and squeezed. He meant it to comfort her, but it had also become a superstition of sorts. The first time, at least, he had meant to comfort her. Since then, it was for his own comfort. No launch had ever failed following the gesture. This calmed him in the way the vodka never could. The bunker walls were bare concrete, the control panel a patchwork of different metals, unmatched switches, knobs, and dials like 100 varieties of flour, faced the wall opposite the door. A half-dozen engineers manned positions at the console, and as many as that stood behind them. The chief designer knew only a few by name. Had Nadia lost weight? He remembered her being meatier, muscles sculpted. She still trained back then, he supposed. No need for that now. Perhaps he simply misremembered. This was only the 5th time his hand had so much as grazed Nadia over the years of the program, once for each launch. Hell, he even managed to touch his own wife more often than that. His wife and son, how long since he had last seen them? He looked at the countdown clock. Some of the engineers called the chief designer Miedved, because they did not know his name, but also because of his breadth. The large scar on his head, too, befitted an animal. The gouge ran from just above his right eyebrow deep into the territory of his balding pate. He would never discuss its origins. Half his teeth were artificial, the incisors grayed like an old, cheap saucer. He slid sideways to the narrow space at the end of the control console, to the bunker's periscope, a box of raw metal with goggles protruding from the side. The distance shrunk the R-7 rocket to toy-like proportions. Only the top showed above the great tulip framework of the launch pad. The 4 metal buttresses gripping the rocket like a vice would not fall away until the thrust reached a certain level. The pad's design had been Mishin's, or was it Bushiev's? The chief designer could never remember. Beyond the pad spread sprawling flatness, the Cossack steppe like something from a nightmare, one where he would run and run and run, but never seem to make progress. Downrange had become a graveyard for spent rocket parts, dropped early stages, shrapnel from the occasional explosion. Not as occasional as the chief designer would have liked. Some of the younger technicians took trucks, vintage from the war, and searched for souvenirs. Mars had returned once with a piece of metal sheeting, the skin from a failed rocket, with a red slash painted on it like a wound. It was the tip of the sickle. He had searched for the hammer, Mars said. But the steppe was a big place, or a non-place. After a certain point, a thing's vastness diminished its identity. The chief designer did not look at the landscape, however. He scanned the sky, grimacing at the gray roiling over the horizon. He had received word of a storm surging across the steppe, the kind that would muddy the whole complex and postpone the mission. There's only so much of nature I can conquer at once, he said, speaking the words as if through the periscope. No one in the control room heard him. The mission had already been delayed once after a single centimeter-long wire shorted out. Of the kilometers of wires, hundreds of vacuum tubes, and thousands of other little electronic devices, all it took was the tiniest glitch to ground the whole thing. The chief designer hated that wire. Sometimes he even hated the engineers who had installed it. In his more generous moods, he would congratulate the engineers on the foresight of the indicator light. Left unrepaired, even that forgettable span of wire could have destroyed the whole rocket. The fuse was always tiny compared to the explosion. The chief designer squeezed back around the console. Mishin, or was it Bushiev, handed him the bottle of vodka. No glasses this time. For the first 2 launches, there had been glasses, so that a successful launch might be toasted. By the time those launches actually occurred, however, there was no vodka left. They had drunk it all in the waiting. The chief designer gripped the bottle with both hands and gulped down a mouthful, like a man emerging from the desert, scared that the substance might turn to illusion if he'd not down it fast enough. He passed the bottle to Mars at the communications terminal quickly, so that the liquid's rippling would not reveal the tremors shooting through his body. Mars took a sip and passed the bottle along. The radio crackled with static and exhaled breath. The chief designer shoved himself next to Mars and took the microphone. T+100, he said. How do you feel? I feel fine. The voice came small and tinny from the speaker. How about you? A round of subdued laughter crested through the bunker. The voice belonged to Leonid, crammed inside the little globe of the Vostok capsule perched atop the R-7. It was the first joke the chief designer ever remembered him making. At least this Leonid. The other one had been trained to tell jokes, to be normal, more than normal. He was the socialist ideal incarnate, as if an ideal was something that could be trained into you. Sometimes the chief designer thought of them, the two Leonids, as the same person, but then that was the whole point. Nadia slipped around the console to the periscope. She didn't press her face against it, but stood back, observing the small image of the rocket fish-eyed by the lens. Speaking of ideals, thought the chief designer, how old was she now? 25? The original cosmonauts, the Vanguard 5, were all the same age, give or take a year. Nadia was the only one among them to achieve grace in a jumpsuit. Her blonde hair so fine, he wondered what the other Nadia's hair had looked like in weightlessness. The first human in space, and no one had thought to take a picture. No one had thought to ask. The only time Nadia's grace had ever failed her was the day before she was scheduled to launch. The little white dog Kasha, herself trained as a cosmonaut, had darted under Nadia's feet in the hallway. The chief designer had been there, along with Mishin and Bushiev, walking from the training center toward the mess, discussing the logistics of launch day, though all of them knew the procedures so well by then that any recapitulation was pointless, beyond even the usual levels of redundancy the engineers favored. Nadia seemed to rise up over the top of Kasha and then toppled to the beige-tiled floor. She looked down, her face seemingly stretched by surprise, not pain. Kasha sat beside Nadia, as if protecting her. Nadia hovered her hand above her knee and said simply, tragically, "It's broken." The chief designer remembered the electric shock those words had caused to pulse under his skin. That was his last clear memory of the first launch. Now he stood, looming over the control panel like the rocket over the pad, both figures to look at them, unlikely to ever leave the ground. His finger floated above the ignition button. Could he press it again? After the first launch, he had always pressed it himself. Whoever's finger did the work, however, the ultimate responsibility was his. It was his button, his rocket, his cosmonaut. No, he would not press it again. He would remove his hand, scrub the mission. He would stand on the scaffold of the launch pad as Leonid emerged from Vostok. He would welcome Leonid home like a son, though Leonid had never actually left the ground. Like Nadia. Like the Nadia who survived. What had her sister's hair looked like in space? "We never think to ask the right questions," he said. The chief designer mouthed the final numbers of the countdown. Piat, 4, 3, 2, 1. He pushed the button, and the engines, all 20 of them, lit as one. Leonid watched himself launch into space. A small spark flashed at the base of the R7, and then it grew, flaring so bright that the rocket itself was swallowed up. He worried something was wrong. Even though he had seen 4 previous launches, the fireball seemed impossible to survive, the rocket a matchstick igniting the sun. He felt the rumble coming even before it rattled the bunker. It knocked him off balance. At breakfast that morning, he'd only managed 2 bites of black bread. His brother, his other self, had eaten everything else. That was the first time they had seen each other in months, one of only a few times over the years. They had always trained separately, always pretending to be one and the same person. Leonid's brother did most of the real training, this Leonid learning just enough to appear capable, his main job to wait, to stay invisible until such a time as he was needed. Until today. Neither brother had spoken a word the whole meal. Now Leonid's breakfast would leave the very planet it came from. The trusswork petals around the rocket separated and then fell back, a bloom of metal and flame. At first by finger breadths and then meters, the rocket rose, and then it ate up sky, leaving whole lengths of itself behind as smoke. Leonid thought of a gray thread stitching blue fabric. The thread grew finer as the rocket drew away, until all he could see was a distant orange glow, fading in and out behind wispy clouds. The glow faded a final time and never returned to view. The smoke trail thinned, feathering at the edges, and took up position in the sky as a narrow cloud, a tether without substance, carried across the steppe by the dry, hot wind. Through the slitted window, Leonid could see the other bunker, the control room, about half a kilometer up the main road. The bunker looked like an anthill from afar, just a bump rising out of the dirt. All the other twins were there now, manning the controls or like Nadia, just watching. Leonid was the last twin, and so this bunker was his alone. The other cots would remain empty. He'd spend the 3 days of the mission sleeping, eating the pre-made meals, and staring out the window at the unchanging scenery. He noted the clouds on the horizon. The storm would soon turn the complex into an edgeless field of muck, but he was grateful for the rain. It was the only movement he would be able to see through the window. His eyes followed the smoke trail up to the vanishing point. He spoke his brother's real name, the one given by their parents, not the one the two of them now shared. Leonid knew that secret name, as did the chief designer, and of course, Tsiolkovsky. No one else, though. Not since grandmother said goodbye and they boarded the train, and Tsiolkovsky spoke to them for the first time. From now on, you're one boy, the same boy. Your only name is Leonid. All of a sudden, that first statement was true. Leonid, in his tiny bunker, with its crack of a window and uncomfortable cot, was the only Leonid on Earth. The bottom of the smoke trail lifted, breaking contact with the ground. Thank you. So none of that happened. So I'll talk. I guess I'll keep a loose eye on the time here, unless someone's going to wave at me. Okay. Yeah. So the idea for this novel happened long before any research for this novel. So there were not actually space twins in the Soviet space program. That was the thing I made up. I did a lot of research on this. I borrow a lot of facts. I pervert a lot of facts of the Soviet space program in writing this novel, but it was absolutely based on the inspiration of things that were actually true to the Soviet space program, which were secrets and conspiracy theories. So while my particular secret/conspiracy theory is made up, there were several that were kind of just as fascinating. And that's sort of, I don't know where the idea came from exactly. By the time the novel's out now, it could be as many as 8 years since I first said space twins really excitedly to somebody. I remember I was at the Decatur Book Festival just visiting, and I met an author friend of mine, and I was like, let me tell you about space twins over lunch. Space twins are awesome. And to be fair, she was very supportive of the idea. So this book at least owes in part to her supportiveness. And the first time I probably revealed my deepest, darkest space twin secrets to anyone. But yeah, so there's one particular conspiracy theory story that I remember in particular. It was that I believe the version I heard was there was a pair of Italian brothers. So we already have brothers introduced here, not twins, but brothers, who had a radio and claimed to have detected transmissions from a Soviet spacecraft still in space long after it was supposed to have returned, and they were basically hearing this dying cosmonaut cursing the people back on Earth for not bringing him home. So that didn't happen either. That's not a real story, but that conspiracy theory was part of the. I feel like that was maybe one of that's certainly the earliest one I remembering. So I think a lot of it came from that, and it's also super dark. And for those of us who are writers, we love that shit. So that's what we live for. But that said, the first word in the novel is Nadia, and she is one of the primary characters that is there throughout the whole novel. And I intentionally made her name the first word because she's not a real person. She's not based on a real person. She's someone I completely made up. And I have massive, massive respect for everyone who was involved from Neil in the American space program to Yuri Gagarin and Valentina Tereshkova in the Soviet space program. I didn't want to diminish the real contributions they made. So while I borrowed some real names where where the chief designer who gets mentioned here at the beginning of the novel and is only ever referred to as the chief designer is based on the real chief designer, Sergei Korolev. He's not that character. He's not meant to be a historical representation of that character. He's the one that's most based on a character just because this was an incredibly interesting man who maybe single-handedly let the Soviets keep up with the Americans in the space race. I don't think you would have had the same situation if he had not been there and present. And he had been sent to the Gulag by Stalin. He almost died. So he's just this incredibly compelling character. So I borrowed him way more. Everybody else is like, I like making things up because I'm a fiction writer. So that's where that went. And that also too, I mention Yuri. I mentioned characters named Yuri and Valentina in the novel, and that is my little. Yes, you are part of my universe, but you're not the first twin to launch into space or the first cosmonaut. I also mention the space dog Laika. Who here doesn't know the story of Laika? You had someone who knows the story of Laika, but yeah. So Laika was the first animal in space, and she was launched into space on Sputnik 2 in 1958. Am I right? I'm looking at my brother right now for my historical knowledge. 57, 58. Okay, we're going to go with that because unless someone's going to call me on it, I'm right. But she was launched into space, and the other part of this concept of not returning was her. When she was launched into space, they knew she would never come back. They didn't have the means of bringing her home at the time. And so at least 98% of the motivation for writing this book was to write an alternate history in which she did not get sent into space to die. So she gets name dropped in one scene, along with Strelka. And then, of course, my biggest apology in this book is that I mentioned a dog named Bielka, and I don't want to give away too much of what that dog is, but it is not the real Bielka, who was a great space hero. And my Bielka is kind of a joke, but the name means squirrel, and it was too perfect to not use for the dog that I needed to mention at one point. So I guess the point is there are real things in here that I reference several real major events, several real major disasters that occurred in the Soviet space program, but I have repurposed them completely. So please do not read any history into this book whatsoever. I abandoned it very quickly, and I tried to signal that as often as possible, even when I'm mentioning, like, Khrushchev is a character in the book, and I hope I made him buffoonish enough that no one's confusing him for the real world. Oh my gosh, I've offended someone in the audience. We have a Khrushchev aficionado. That's the fun of like super powerful, famous people. Like people at that level of power, you can just turn into buffoons with no regard to the historical record because they've achieved such status that you can ignore it. Let's see. Any other thoughts? Stephanie, Josh? Huh? 57? Oh, wow. I was not giving them credit for it. So, yeah. So the reason they couldn't bring Laika home, here's some space trivia. That's what we're degrading to before I take questions, was that they launched Sputnik 1 and the story goes that Khrushchev was so excited by it, so I borrowed this a little bit, that he wanted the next launch in time for the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So they wanted it by November, whatever that was. And so under this pressure, the engineers and technicians rushed to complete a rocket to get Laika launchable for space. They wanted this as an occasion. And had they been on their own pace, they might not have done that. There have been some historical records since then that dispute that maybe the chief designer himself, a man of giant ambitions, may have wanted this. There's no definitive historical record. The most common story, though, is that they were pressured to do it more quickly than was reasonable, and so had to sacrifice the dog in order to reach the unrealistic deadline. But if you don't know Laika, there's several. At the back of my book, in my acknowledgments, I thank a few books, but there's a really beautiful graphic novel called Laika. And I strongly recommend reading that because she's a beautiful space hero of the world. And there are also, I mentioned the space dog Strelka too, and I'm going to say that, so I mentioned that I have some swag here. So I have these 8x10 prints. So if you take a selfie with the book, I will just throw one of these at you. Probably not, that would ding the corners. But I might throw this wonderful Strelka pin. So it's a little lapel pin with the name of the book featuring the space dog Strelka, who is one of my favorite. Strelka and Bielka survived. They were the first creatures to go to space and come back. And And the best piece of space trivia ever is that Strelka had puppies. And Khrushchev, sort of as a jab at Kennedy, gave one of the puppies to Kennedy. The Strelka puppy had puppies with one of Kennedy's dogs. And so there's a line of presidential space dogs out there. And one day I shall adopt. That's a life goal. I mean, anyone have any question? I mean, I feel like, okay. Yes, you need to go to the microphone. Yes, please use the microphone for questions.
Very official, Zach. Or Josh. No, Zach. Sorry, Josh. So I've had the privilege of knowing you for about a year and a half now, and I'm very grateful for that fact, and also working with your lovely partner and knowing your brother, who's a delight in his own right.
And is taking a picture of you right now.
Is my hair okay? So one thing I've never asked you, but always kind of wondered, and it seems appropriate that you might be able to answer it here tonight, is how did you? Because your brother is this rocket scientist, literally. But you did not follow that engineering path. How did you did you always grow up being interested in space, or how did that kind of happen within the Powers family?
Well, I mean, Josh, this is going to be a whole talk about you, so I'm sure you're not going to be blushing at all. Yeah. No, so I mean, space shuttle launches were common fare on TV growing up. So I watched a lot of space shuttle launches. Josh had satellite tracking software, so we would go. I mean, I remember we lived outside of Atlanta from when I was in middle school through high school. And I remember though that's I guess that when the technology got good enough that he would know when a particularly bright satellite would be passing overhead, or the space shuttle. This was pre-space station, so we didn't have, which is very easy to see in the night sky. But we would go outside. He would direct us with the whole family, and he'd direct us like, it's going to come up over there. And as the member of the family that does not wear glasses, still to this day, it was my job to sort of like glare at the horizon until the first little, I mean, these are little tiny pinpricks. I mean, you can barely see them, but once they move very fast though. So once you get a sight of them, they're not hard to keep up with because they're moving. And the only thing that's moving in the sky other than a plane, which is very different. So it's things like that. And I also say that, I mean, our dad read the Isaac Asimov's Foundation series to us out loud growing up. So I certainly was exposed to science fiction. I mean, and, I have some Star Wars action figures, it happens. I don't just have real figures as action figures. I have, I have my son, and if anyone wants to turn this into a long form discussion of Star Trek: The Next Generation, I am game. So, I can roll on that front. So actually there's another event here tomorrow night with the author Tope Falarin, and I may crash it and turn his Q&A into a Star Trek Next Generation discussion. He's also a fan. So you should come see his talk tomorrow night as well. But yeah, so it was partly real space things, and that just, I mean, I guess looking back, that's not what most people had growing up, but you don't question those things when you're a kid. That's like, of course there's a space shuttle launch on TV. Why would there not be? Why would you not go outside and try to find satellites? Why aren't the other families out here on our street doing the same thing? Obviously, it's common knowledge. But same with science fiction. I mean, this book has gotten a lot of love from like science fiction reviews and blogs, which surprises me because I think it's going to anger some science fiction fans, but it's really thoughtful. No, I love science fiction. That sounded snotty. I don't like that at all. I retract that. No, because I love science fiction. Science fiction is thoughtful and deep, but this is not hard sci-fi. So I worry that the hard sci-fi fans are going to pick this up and be disappointed. And that's my big marketing fear. I'm the director of communications at the Writer Center. So I spend my day thinking about things like this. Hi, Margaret. I have many of my colleagues and my boss in the audience, and a board member. So they're like, yeah, I've overthought the marketing of this book far too much. That's why there was a giant glass of liquor over in the other. Anyone else?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Oh.
So at 9:25 tonight, there is the space station going over DC. I didn't set that up for you, but you're welcome.
Oh, thank you.
So I actually have a real question for you, which is, this is a pretty intricately plotted book, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about actually the process of writing it. And you could make jokes, but I actually really want to know how you put this together.
Sure. I'm not an outliner. I tend to know a few points I want to hit along the way, but also the act of writing is me realizing that I have no idea what was. I start with an idea, I throw some characters into the idea, and then I like to see where their characters go. I've written entire short stories with zero planning before. With a novel that was not feasible, you need a little more structure. So I had the Space Twins idea, and then I sat on the idea for a while. So just in the brain, it grows into something a little more complicated than 2 words. But then I said, okay, this seems like a novel. It seems like this is complicated enough, with enough twists, with enough characters will be involved to reach a certain word count, for lack of to make it as crude and practical as possible. And then I started researching. So I'd never researched for writing before. This was the first, when I read a short story, not counting Googling along the way, I tried to think of an example, but I couldn't get one. There was lots of Googling in this novel. There was so much Googling, and occasionally asking Josh a question that would be faster than Googling it. And also Stephanie. Oh, are you shaking your head at me? She thought I forgot her. No, I did not. Stephanie's a research librarian. So if you want to be a writer, live with a research librarian, because then you never have to do any work. Except the writing. I researched, did nothing but research for probably about 6 months. I read however many books on the subject or related subjects. I took notes on them. I typed those notes up. I created several documents that I just kept on my computer that I'd reference from time to time. But once I start writing, I don't go back to things too much. Occasionally I'll go back and I wrote 50 pages and I go back and look at the notes again to see, oh, I forgot about that. That's a cool thing. I want to find a place for that. So it was at that point, the research had prepared me the thing had a shape in my head to some degree, but I don't think I could write if I knew where I was going at the very beginning. I'm not, there's the level of if something happens on page 1, I'm writing page 2 to begin figuring out how or what happened, how it happened or what exactly happened. And so I didn't know when I wrote the word Nadia, which was, that sentence was in my head for a long time, or a variation of that sentence. Nadia was the twin who was supposed to die, or had been the twin who was supposed to die. I think the original was Nadia was the twin who was supposed to die, and I didn't like the double was's. So, so that was there. I didn't know what that meant, and so I was writing the novel to figure out, okay, what does it mean that this was the twin? And honestly, when I started writing the book, I thought Nadia would be a point of view character, and she didn't end up being one, because she was almost too different. I couldn't get myself in her head. So anyway, so I wrote, and then usually some point towards the middle of writing, I realize an endpoint. And then that's the thing, that's the thing I end up sort of working towards. So there was, I think I posted a picture online to maybe Hannah. Where's Hannah somewhere? I don't know. Responding to you, I think, about, I have 11 by 17 sheets of paper, and I'll draw little story arcs with notes on them and things, or, lines. And what was the one on there? It was shenanigans and, and my notes are things like shenanigans and boredom. And that's the extent, but it's just little reminders okay, I'm not a strict subscriber to the traditional story arc, but I think it's a good reference when you're working to keep you moving forward. So that I came to literary fiction from science fiction by way of Murakami. And if you've read Haruki Murakami, there's little in the way of traditional plot. So it is not my biggest concern when I'm writing. How I love forward motion. I love a feeling of a book moving forward, but that isn't necessarily achieved through a traditional story arc. Was that it? I don't know. I just talked for a long time and said lots of things. All right. We work together, so you can ask me again tomorrow, and it'll be fine.
I got 2.
Oh, that's cheating.
One's short, one's very personal. It's not on, is it? Okay, it doesn't matter. First of all, there's this wonderful side plot in this book about, I'm going to bungle his name, about Kimelnitsky.
I'm going to bungle it too, so yes. Kimelnitsky is what I've been going, I think, yeah.
Did you make that up out of whole cloth?
It is probably about half and half. So the earliest part of that was more from the historical record, because he's a real character.
That is a real person.
He's a real person. But he's actually an awful human being. So I for the set, but it's a grandmother telling this tale of this character. So she is not related. She mentions it at one point even that he wasn't that great a guy, but he was far more than not just great a guy. But it's a grandmother telling stories to her grandchildren. So it is cleansed somewhat because of the way it's being told. The initial scene was like initial ideas were based on real things. The thing that happened was from something I read. I didn't take any details from it though, other than I knew he fought with the Poles and almost died in battle and was a slave to the Turks. But I made up my own.
Yeah, that part sings. The personal question is, and I'm going to let you contextualize this because I don't want to give any spoilers. But we're all among friends, so be as introspective as you want to be. If you had to pick, which Leonid would you have been?
Oh, ooh,
Yeah,
I mean,
wrestle with that.
because I could technically go. But there's also flashbacks to them as kids, so I could technically draw from 4.
Post-launch.
Okay, post-launch.
Or even pre and then.
I mean, to be fair, the Leonid in space thinks some random shit, and so that's probably closest to me, if I'm being honest. Yeah, but I mean, there's also a lot of characters closest to me. The Earthbound Leonid reflects not me necessarily now, but me as a 20-something. Sure, kind of mopey. I mean, granted, he has plenty of reasons to be mopey, but I drew on my own personal mope to yeah. So I think I really loved writing the Spacebound Leonid because anything went, because this is a dude just thinking in space. So yeah, I don't think I've given away too much with that. So I don't want to go any further because then there's spoilers. So all right, thank you. Anyone else? Oh, microphone? Yeah. Is it not working? It's on. Yeah.
So, have you ever read Stephen King's On Writing?
Yes, but
Okay,
a long time ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
So, anyway, his thing is write your first draft with the doors closed, as if no one else is ever going to read it. And I love that so much. And are there any parts in your book that you feel like when you were writing it that you felt would be too much, or that you heard resistance about? And if so, where were they, and how did you negotiate that?
Wow. I'm going to have to think here for a minute. I mean, I'm probably guilty of writing away from those moments and avoiding them to some extent.
Like what? For example, were you considering?
I mean, I'm also trying to think because there's a couple moments that are more packed, but they're very plot centric, so I can't discuss them without absolutely spoiling a major point of the novel. And speaking of Stephen King, I actually have a very strong, I won't quite say revulsion, but I'm really turned away, and this is not a judgment, this is a personal preference from grotesquerie. And and then I find myself writing it sometimes. So I'm a hypocrite, is what it comes down to. But there is a moment that is very graphic in the novel. That is, the novel has tragedy. It's not all funny space dog jokes. I mean, the novel's conceit is one of loss. So I'm dealing with loss. I don't know. I mean, one thing I deliberately wrote away from, and I heard someone mention that there was elements of romance in this novel, and I worked so hard to write away from that, so that surprised me a little bit. So that's just something that I feel like when I was younger and writing stories, I was a little more interested in and exploring how it worked, and I'm a little less interested in, and so I intentionally wrote characters that I thought were more platonic. Just so there were decisions like I didn't want this to be. Leonid and Nadia spend a lot of time together. In fact, almost their entire portion of the novel is spent together. And I intentionally wrote that very much as much, there is affection, but I intentionally tried to avoid the more romantic elements of affection. particularly since Leonid was actually closer with Nadia's sister. So there's all kinds of complicated things there. So I wrote, I don't know, I need to like get back to you on that one because it's too, yeah. Anybody else? No one else? I'll give someone a free pen. Okay, yeah.
It's good to see a
Good to see
fellow former Savannah.
exactly.
I no longer live there. It breaks my heart.
Oh,
but,
where are you now?
I beg your pardon.
Where are you now?
I'm in Delray, Virginia.
Okay.
Gentrifying the hell out of the place. So along those lines, you've mentioned socialism a few times, and it's a word that is getting a lot of play these days. I often struggle with the idea that so many younger people, I'm a septuagenarian, by the way, but so many younger people seem to think it's all so great. But, you know, if you watch Khrushchev in the Chernobyl series on television, from what you've said about the deceptions you discovered while researching this book, has that affected your opinion of socialism at all? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point I take from it, and I'm not claiming to be an expert on the subject, but we're in a place called Politics and Prose, so I can go there. I think there's, I think maybe the United States right now is a good case study in the economic system being detached from the political system. That socialism is an economic system, and the authoritarianism is not necessarily connected to that. And I think that's what a younger generation of Americans is seeing in socialism, that it's not tied in. I was born in '80. I have an older brother, so I'm aware of the Cold War mentality. I'm kind of steeped in it. You know, I can watch the old Cold War movies and really, and they get something very deep in me. Some just very basic instinct that was bred into me. But that was an issue of. It was more an issue of authoritarian. I mean, the communist systems were being forced upon places, for the most part, whether they wanted them or not, from the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and they were maintained through authoritarian systems. And I think the authoritarian system is something. I don't explore it too much. I mean, it's. Stalin didn't start in the novel. There's sections flashing back to when the Leonid twins were boys in a Ukrainian village, and I borrow from a real piece of history. There's a recent book on it. I think it's called Red Famine, but I can't remember that. For Red Famine, about the fact that Stalin deliberately starved Ukrainian villages to kill them. That's not because of socialism. That's because he was an egomaniacal tyrant, and he recognized this political moment to seize power. And then his influence is the one that ends up being the influence of the Soviet Union for the entire existence of the Soviet Union. Even when there were, even under Khrushchev or under Gorbachev, when there were like softening periods, that legacy is not something that was going to be, and Putin's back and doing it again. So it's, that legacy is carried over, and I think is detached from socialism. And I think the reason it's not as taboo for a younger generation is because there's no memory of the Cold War as we remember it. And so for them, it's like, why wouldn't we look at this thing that sounds nice? Like, that kind of makes sense to me. And it's not tied into the darker aspects of the history that we remember. And not just the history, but the propaganda. I mean, we were absolutely pitted against them in a propagandistic kind of way because of how that system was played out by the U.S. government. So, and now I feel like I should never talk about the subject again. So, yeah. Oh, okay, thank you. I'm looking at you now for approval. So,
Zach, I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm so excited to read this book. I'm wondering if you were just prescient or just really lucky that the book came out the summer of the 50th anniversary of the original Moonwalk. Were you thinking as you were writing this, right, we're going to have a major anniversary?
No, the idea for the book was, like I said, 8 years ago. I finished the draft. Oh God, there went his helmet.
Oh,
it's
no,
okay, he's on Earth.
Just one small step.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'll fix Neil here while I talk. So yeah, I mean, I finished the book, Stephanie. It was how long ago? It's since I finished the first draft, 5 or 6 years. So several things I couldn't have predicted. I didn't know until after the book was sold. Like they told me the release date, then someone told me pointed out the anniversary was coming up. It's like, oh, I should tell them. So and I did. So no, they didn't know when they picked the release date. I didn't know writing the book. And certainly, I mean, speaking of political issues, there was no way I could have predicted when I wrote this book beforehand that there would be some relevancy talking about the Soviet Union and deceptions and fakeness.
You got lucky.
And yeah, fake news is not a phrase we had when I wrote this book. So yeah.
So a second question, not as political, but certainly as a thinking question. So what do you, as someone who's thought a lot about the space, it looks like we're entering another space race. Who can get back to the moon first? Who could get to Mars first? Do you have thoughts on that, or you're just like, let's get there so that my book will be made into a mini series?
Well, you already stole my honest answer, so I will. But no, I mean, it's interesting. Space exploration is always an interesting topic because the cost is massive to pull this off, and it's first time now we have private sector who's not just providing the vehicles and the services behind it, but also driving the agenda behind it some too. Josh, I'm going to look at you for confirmation on this one. But I think one of the things that comes up all the time that I think about a lot is you were focusing on this big, perceived as impractical thing, while there are still glaring issues to be dealt with on a personal and social and societal level. But I also think, I mean, I look back in the 500,000 people who worked on Apollo. It's not like it's not anyone who's gone back to their, the memory foam mattress. I mean, you've got that because there was space exploration first. You're using your cell phones. There are very tangible, direct, positive results for everyday life. It's not an either or proposition that you're either doing this or doing. I mean, it's the next thing. It's exploration. I think we need to avoid concepts like colonizing some because it's so steeped in major issues, major historical atrocities. But exploring is, from when you're a kid, you're going into the woods, you're going a little further into the woods, you're going a little further into the woods. And that's a very human impulse. And I think we do discover something about humanity as a species by doing it. And I don't think it detracts from the efforts we can make at the same time for more direct, practical pursuits. So that's my big, broad one. But yeah, I mean, I think we need to go to Mars because it's next. We need to go to Mars because we might have to go to Mars one day. Humanity, the human species is really shitty at, I mean, let's look at the climate. We're really shitty at looking at something's long-term effects. We're really, really not good at it. And I think that's one of the things that space exploration has been hurt, because we were excited when we went to the moon. We were excited with the space shuttle to a lesser but still real extent. And then when it was still the space shuttle and still the space shuttle and still the space shuttle, we lost that excitement. But there's this definite real long-term progress benefit, I think, to doing it that will have great repercussions if we can get it together to do these things. So, I mean, again, practically speaking, though, there's resources, and I hate to see, us go strip mine the asteroid belt, but there are things we can take advantage of in the solar system more broadly.
Yes, good answer.
Oh, thank you. Who's next? Yes. Okay.
Hi. Twin relationships have always fascinated me, and I was just wondering what informed the relationships that you captured in your story, whether you have been close to twins ever in your life, if there are any twins in literature who you thought more deeply about. I just really wanted to hear a little bit more about the twins?
Fred and George Weasley. No. So we do have some twins in the family, but we weren't too close to them. There's one branch of my mom's side of the family that has 3 generations straight with twins. So I mean, when you're a kid, that seems cool. For the adult versions of the characters, which is most of the book, they never interact with their twins on camera, so to speak. And they've also been intentionally separated from them. In that first chapter, like he says, I barely saw him I saw him just a few times over the years. So by that point, it's exploring a little bit the loss of closeness, that people who were closer than I can possibly imagine in terms of genes and growing up. Josh is 4.5 years older than me, so we were certainly as close as brothers, but also that's a pretty big gap. We never were in high school at the same time. Like, those milestones were always separated by this perfect gap of time. So we didn't have a twin relationship. So it was mostly imagined. I can't say that I did any particular twin research. It was a form of closeness that just intrigued me. So, and again, space twins was, yeah. I always I don't want to give myself too much credit for thinking about twins. It was a weird idea I had that I ran with. So, yeah. No one else? Yes.
Hey, yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned that this book was at least partly inspired by sort of Russian conspiracy theories about lost cosmonauts. There's obviously sort of the American flavor of like the moon landing being fake, and these conspiracy theories always seem to be sort of negative, that we couldn't have possibly achieved the things that the authorities say we did. I'm curious, did that at all play into how you were writing? That the story you're telling is clearly more negative than the one that actually happened, although obviously Laika's a pretty negative story. That you mentioned the sort of positives of NASA exploring further has this great, potential, but that we have a hard time accepting it.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'll say that I haven't said, I should have mentioned earlier, is that I was focused on conspiracy theories, but I was also focused on the real tragedies, because there are lots of real tragedies. And in the Soviet Union, they were not revealed. These things happened in the 60s or earlier and weren't revealed until the late 80s or 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. A famous example is that there's a very well-known photograph of Yuri Gagarin, and he's sitting there in his helmet, and it's just sort of empty space behind him. That photo has been airbrushed because there was a cosmonaut standing behind him who died in training and who was erased from the historical record until the 80s or 90s. There were cosmonauts who died in training who were interred in just common graves, and it wasn't until 30, 40 years later they were given monuments as being part of this effort. There is speaking of the Italian twins who heard the cosmonaut on the radio, there's actually a real story of a cosmonaut who was returning, and I believe the parachute didn't operate, and as he fell to his death, basically screamed curses at the technicians and engineers who had failed to keep him alive. So while there are amazing conspiracy theories, there are lots and lots of real secrecy and real tragedies around it. So the darkness, I don't know what the book would have been if I had not found those things in research. So I didn't know all those things when I started researching. I read a book by Asif Siddiqui. He has several, and I think it's Sputnik and the Soviet Space Challenge is the one that wasn't the time frame I needed and the one I used most. But he was the first English language historian to tackle this subject. And so basically, unless you read that book in English or were somehow a scholar otherwise, these were things you just wouldn't know. And he wrote this book, went in the archives basically right when they were available, got all this information, and put it out there. So I think I was shocked from my fun, goofy concept to something a little darker by that. And I think the novel, there is hopefulness in the novel. I mean, for all the dark conceit, I think these are characters striving towards something, while they are dealing with very dark pasts, from the chief designer and his almost dying in the gulag to the constant threat of the pressure he's facing the risk of going back if he doesn't succeed, to these twins who've lost something. They're trying to find a way forward. And I think that spirit relates to the spirit of space exploration, that we're trying to find a way forward as a species. And, I don't know. I mean, if reading science fiction, 20 years ago and reading science fiction now, it's a very different feel for what we think about those things. The hopefulness is certainly different. But I still think there's hope in it. I mean, if you can't have some hope on something, then, what's the point, right? So I don't know. I find even in my dark story, I find hope in the way they're not necessarily trying to run away from the endeavor. They still recognize the value of the endeavor, and maybe even in their tragedies recognize their place and the worth of what they've sacrificed for it. But these people their struggles are personal versus institutional, I guess. Anybody? There's 2 minutes left. I can totally answer one more question.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
If I'm remembering correctly, you wrote the book in 3 different time periods, yeah? When you're writing, this is, I guess, a craft question for those of us who are sort of on this path at the newer starting place of it. Do you write, when you wrote it, did you write it you just went between the time periods, or did you write it sort of in its one time period and then another and then another?
No, because I did the first. So I wrote through. When it was time to tell a backstory, I wrote the backstory. And the reason is because when there's multiple parts like that, what interests me is in how they work with each other. So if there's a flashback to the Leonid twins in their Ukrainian village, it's because I realized at that point it was going to relate, the story that I wanted to tell there was going to relate to the story that was going on in the present of the novel. When there's a story of Khmelnytsky, the folk hero, so there's these nested flashbacks where that's not even necessarily a flashback, but so you'd have flashback to this Ukrainian village when the twins are boys, and then the grandmother would tell a story which flashed back to Ukrainian history or a folktale version of Ukrainian history. And I was interested in how, and there's a few other smaller moving parts in there, but whenever they come up, it was because I was interested in how this moving part informs and influences this moving part, and how there's this little tiny gap between them. And in that gap, if you think back on what you just read, or they talk to each other. And when they talk to each other, you get something you don't get just by, if I just written them individually and then spliced them together, they wouldn't be in communication with each other in the same way. So there was, especially the flash, because it's not the whole story of the twins' lives in the Ukrainian village. You have the ratio of the novel is 90% in the present of the novel, following either the chief designer or Leonid and Nadia. The flashbacks are a much, much lesser part of that. So I picked and chose. Was like, I just feel like there's a point now where Leonid's memory needs to kick in, and what is the memory that would be relevant right now of that time? And those were fun because they were also, just in terms of being a writer, they were so free from research. I didn't have to I invented that village completely. I looked at a few photographs I found of Ukrainian villages of the right time frame, I think. I didn't ask too hard. And so I wrote those villages, and they're release valves too. I mean, just this is just straight storytelling. This is stepping away from the conceit of the novel and the story of two twins. So maybe it goes back to the twins question a little bit too, that I was, what are twins like? What are they like in this village they're starving. The setting of the village is a village being denied food by Stalin during a drought, but they're living otherwise normal lives in that situation. They don't even know what a space program is. There isn't a space program yet, so it's as separate from that world as can be.
Well, thank you very much. Why don't we give another hand for Zach Powers?